This video will be an overview of all the parts in the high voltage upgrade kit for the BBSHD motor. This is not going to be an end-to-end installation because everybody's different bikes and builds will be slightly different at least. It will go over the main tasks you have to perform along with lots of tips and tricks to help you get the best bike you can get. If there's anything you feel I've not covered or think would be helpful to people, please let us know and I can either add it to the website or a future update to this video. This video has to assume that the person watching is new to DIY e-bikes. So we'll be covering a lot of the basics, and if this is a bit simplistic at times, then I guess that's great really, because it just means that you're likely already in a good place to do this kind of thing. Don't feel obligated to listen to me talking about battery connections if you're an experienced bike builder, and there are timestamps in the descriptions which will help you navigate. For some people though, they will never have opened up a BBSHD motor before or even installed one if they bought a complete bike. And there are best practices for many of the components and parts, and the knowledge in this video will help ensure a good, solid, reliable build. So I really hope this guide is helpful, and if I've missed anything, please let me know. I still learn every single day that I work with light electric vehicles, and I don't expect to stop that learning process. I can tell you right now that I am personally a long way away from being the best bike mechanic in the world. So essentially what I'm saying is, if I can do this stuff, then you can too. So the first thing to look at is batteries, or specifically the battery connection. When you're installing the high voltage kit, leave the battery unplugged. Don't plug it in until the work's done. Everything is hooked up and you're ready to test. If you need to work on your bike, it's also best to unplug this battery first, or your battery first, because it can't hurt, and at best it's going to save you from damaging something that's expensive and lose you a whole bunch of riding time, which no one wants to see. There is a best practice way to connect batteries, and we'll have a look at how it's done with the XT90 connectors that we supply with our harness. And we actually supply a female XT90 anti-spark connector with all our kits. So if you don't have one already on your battery, you can solder one on or get one soldered on. And sort of RC hobby shops are a good place to go and get that done if you're not comfortable with soldering, or at least find someone that is comfortable soldering these kind of big connections, or better still, get a battery with one of these on to start with, because if the battery has an Anderson connector, which is this style, they're not rated to take high amps. So you want one of these XT90 connectors really as a minimum with our kits. Bad solder jobs can lead to short circuits and damage to your bike and potentially person. So make sure that is done right. We do recommend this type of connector because it has a resistor inside it, which charges slowly to the full battery voltage. And this prevents arcing, which would cause carbon buildup, and that would over time degrade the connection with your battery. So if you look at the XT90 connector, you can see that it has green markings, and these are key to how to use it. So you simply take the connector on the controller and you push it on up to the first marking, and you'll feel some resistance there. And you hold it there and you basically count for about 5 to 7 seconds, and then you push them together. And if you hear a pop when this happens, you either didn't leave it long enough, or possibly there's an issue with the resistor inside. Maybe there's some damage. When you unplug the battery, you don't have to worry about any of this. You can just straight pull it apart. This is meant to be easy. It's just a case of getting into some good habits when you do this. So just remember, always unplug the battery before you work on your bike, because if you make a mistake with the harness when you're working and the battery is live, then the chances are you'll need a new controller, and nobody wants to see that, least of all us. Let's start things off with the motor itself, because for a good number of you about to use one of our upgrade kits, this will be the first time that you look inside of the motor. Before you can install our kit though, you need to remove the stock controller and do some housekeeping to give yourself a good clean installation of the new wiring. I have a few motors here, and I'm going to use them to go over a few key areas and things to look out for. So this over here is the BBSHD, and it's a truly remarkable little motor because it can deliver power up to 4 kilowatts, far in excess of its design capability. But there are some limitations, and by respecting those, you can have an awesome bike that will last a long time with little maintenance required. You don't actually have to remove the BBSHD from the bike in order to do this work. In fact, in terms of measuring wires for fit and routing, it's best that the motor is on the bike. If you're replacing the nylon gear or doing other work, you should do this first, and other guides will help with this. I find personally that the easiest way to do this is to flip the bike over onto its saddle and bars. If you have a bike stand, you can absolutely use one of those as well. If you're doing it the way I do, then you can use some scrap wood to lift the bars off the ground if needed, so you don't damage things like brake levers. They're in the way. It's probably a good idea at this point to remove anything you don't need from the frame, and definitely make sure that the battery is disconnected. It depends a little whether this is a build from scratch bike or an upgrade that you're doing to a pre-built bike as to what you need to set things up here. So the stock controller is held on by 3 bolts, which are of the hex head variety. So here, here, and here, unless you own the new M65 version, in which case they are the Torx variety. I don't actually have the original stock controllers for any of my motors, but I can tell you exactly what to expect and what to watch out for. The first thing to look out for is there's a rubber seal that goes around the edge here. And you can see on this motor where it is. And it can get a bit stuck to the inside of the stock controller. And if you pull on it, then it can get a bit damaged and need replacing. The trick is to do it really gently. And if you can see that it's sticking to any part of the controller, to just gently ease those free. And some of the best tools for doing that are these pick tools. And you can get them pretty much anywhere. Like I got them from a car parts place. Once the controller is free of the gasket though, you can then move on to unplugging the phase wires, and those are these 3 things here. So yellow, blue and green wires, and they simply just pull apart, and there shouldn't be any real resistance at all. You will still have though this PAS plug and the hall sensor plug in at the same time, and it can be a little bit cramped, so you've got to be quite careful when you pull them apart not to overly yank on this, because you don't want to damage particularly this wiring here to the PAS plug. Once you have these unplugged, the next stage is to deal with the PAS plug and the hall sensor plug. And you're going to notice that inside of this, Bafang likes to use lots and lots of this white silicone, and they can even use a little bit of glue on here. So you got to take it quite carefully, quite slowly, fair bit of patience. The pick tools are great for removing little bits of glue and picking away the silicone just gradually, bit by bit. And when you've freed them up enough, you can just unplug them, and they shouldn't cause you any issues at all. It sounds delicate and tricky, but to put it in perspective, I've never managed to screw this up, and I am not a world-class mechanic. So if you take your time and you're patient, you shouldn't have any problems. If you look at this motor here, it was actually prepared by a really good bike mechanic from North Bay Electric Bikes, who actually donated a motor for this build. And you can see that they actually removed all of the original silicone from around these plugs, and they replaced it with some fresh silicone. So it gives a really clean look. And if you can get your motor to look like this, you'll be doing really well. And once it is in this state, it's going to be ready to replace these connections with the new ones that will go to the BAC855 controller. To get a really good build takes a bit of planning. Essentially, we're supplying a plug and play kit, which you then need to arrange onto your bike and connect together. So taking a bit of time to see where you want things to go is well worthwhile. You'll need to find places for the battery, for the BAC855 controller, and then plan the best route for wiring to keep everything dry and secure. And everyone's bike frame will be a bit different. So rather than get too specific here, I'm going to talk about general concepts. And if you're struggling with something on a particular frame, just get in touch via Discord, post in the support channels, and everyone can help further from there. So let's start off with the controller itself, and this is the BAC855 from ASI, and we need to find a spot to locate this on the frame, and we supply a mount with our kits to do this, and it's intended to be as versatile as possible in where you can locate it. The back itself is IP67 rated, the exception being the JST connection on the back. And we'll discuss ways to minimize the risk to this area of the controller as we go over things. As well as this 24-pin JST connector, there are also the 3 phase wires in blue, green, and yellow, and also the positive and negative for the battery connection. And again, this battery connection should be the very last thing that you do with any install or potentially a bench test that you do with this kit. We supply the harness wires that come with the kit to be as versatile as possible in terms of where you can mount the controller, but there are limitations to the length of the wiring. Most people tend to install the controller to the down tube of the bike here, but in this particular frame there's also the option to install it in here, and I've also seen people install controllers on the seat tube as well with hardtail bikes. It all depends on what kind of battery you have and where you want to put other things. The reason the mount is shaped like this is because if you have braze-ons for water bottles, it can sit in this slot, but you can also actually use this slot if you want to feed wiring toward the front of the bike up through it. It's been done to be basically to give people as many options as they can to put this on the bike. If you are struggling to find a good location, again, get in touch, and I'm sure we're going to have some hints and tips to help you out with that. Wherever you choose to locate the controller, it's important to think about the flow of water and the direction that this water might take when the bike's in use. And you're going to be much better off if you orient the controller so that bulk water runs away. So if this is on the down tube and the water is coming this way, gravity is naturally going to be taking the water away from the wiring and dripping down towards the bottom of the bike. And there'll be lots more tips for preventing water damage throughout this video. Once you've decided where you're going to put this on the bike, the next stage is to look at the wiring and figure out the best routing for the wiring that you need to do to prevent it from being pinched and keeping it protected while the bike is in use. Let's look now at the phase wires, and these are the green, yellow and blue wires that terminate on one end with a 3-pin plug. And this plug is a one-way fit, so it's essentially impossible to get this the wrong way around when you plug it into the BAC855. The other end of these, though, have connectors with which to plug into the connectors on the BBSHD, and they're simply blue to blue, green to green, yellow to yellow. We do actually supply an option with this to have these sent out uncrimped, and the idea with this is that you measure the distance that you need to connect it into where you have the controller sited or located, and then you can have a perfect length of wire. Or we can supply these pre-crimped on, whichever you choose, really. If you choose to go with the crimping route, there is a video also to explain the best way to do that and the kind of tools that you'll need, and that's on the High Voltage website. The basic principle with this is to create as smooth a path as possible from the motor around to where you might mount the controller. And you can hold this in place with zip ties. If you don't like seeing the color of the wires, you could put some sheathing on this, and there's various types of plastic tubing and wraps that you can use if you wanted to more closely match the frame of your bike. You'll also notice with the phase wires there's a grommet which we pre-install on it, and this actually clips into the cover plate for the motor, and it just slots in here. And you will probably need, though, to adjust the position of this so that when it all goes on the motor there's just the right amount of wire in here and it fits on nicely. As I said before, the connections themselves are very, very simple to make, and they just clip in. So blue to blue, green to green, and yellow to yellow. And I suggest making this part first and getting it sized to fit correctly with where the grommet goes, and then feed it around to where you want the controller to sit on the bike. I've already pre-done this one to where we want to put the controller. The wires you get with the kit, if you do it this way, will actually be a bit longer, so you can cut them to wherever you want the controller to go on the bike. We should spend a little bit of time as well on zip ties at this point, because they're wonderful things, but they can cause problems if they're used incorrectly. And the main issue we see is with the zip ties being over tightened, and there are sharp edges really on the insides of these, and they can pinch and cut into wiring. And with something like the phase wires, they're so thick and there's so much insulation around them, it's not really a problem. You'd have to really crank them down to cause an issue with the phase wiring. Where it's more of a problem is with the thinner wires that take the communication signals, like things like 5-volt feeds and ground feeds to the peripherals, to the hall sensors, and to the speed sensor and to the PAS sensor. And the gauge of these wires is like, I think 18 or something. It's much smaller. And the pressure from a zip tie can actually fracture the strands inside. And if you pinch a wire too tight, if that wire is then pulled, that can actually completely break and sever the wire inside. And then you're going to get communication errors like 30H and things like that. And that's not great. And at worst, it could actually short two wires together inside, and if that's the positive, then it could actually fry the controller. And it quite commonly happens when they're zip tied too tight on the handlebars, and then when the handlebars are turned, it pulls on the harness wire, and then that causes a fracture or a break. And the trick with these is basically not to ratchet them too tight and to make things snug so they don't flop about but not bite into the wire. So check that if you pull on the wire, it's not then going to cause a fracture. And to help with this, we are actually starting to send out our kits now with some of these. And these is basically just a little piece that goes around the wire, and it spreads out the load and it stops it biting in on the edges, and it'll keep the wire in place without causing problems. And if you have a printer yourself and want to use these, I'll make these available, and you can print them out yourself. So that's zip ties. So make sure you're not over tightening them, or use some of these if we've sent them out, or print them off. And it's going to save you a lot of heartache and a lot of trying to trace problems, because 30H is a real pain in the butt, and we want you to ride your bike and not have to mess around with harness wires over and over again. The other major piece of wiring you're going to be doing is the main harness, and this uses bundles of smaller wires that go to plugs, and they allow the BAC855 to communicate with the hall and PAS sensors, as well as receive inputs from speed sensor and the display unit and the throttle and any brake cutoffs. Pretty much any information that needs to go from other parts of the bike to the back comes through this harness wire, and it also sends key bits of information to the motor, to the PAS sensor, and to the hall sensors. Before you start plugging anything in or strapping any parts of this to the frame, it's important to do a dry fit of the wiring loom and make sure there's enough length to do what you want and put things where you want them to be, and that it won't get compromised by, say, the bike suspension, where it swings here, or anything like that. And if you're having difficulty getting this to work with your frame, by all means get in touch online, use the Discord server, and I'm sure between us and the community we'll find something that will work for you. With the harness, there are several key parts to look out for, and I'm going to go over those so you know exactly what each part does. And the first thing to look at is the 24-pin JST connector. This is the large one, and it has all the wiring going to the controller. It only goes in one way, and you can determine the orientation by using the fins and the guides in the plastic. On one side of the connector, there is also a smaller clip, and this is to prevent the connector from falling out of the BAC855. When you plug it in, it should latch into place and give you an audible click. and that will prevent it from pulling loose. So if you look at the controller here and you look at the way it's oriented, you want to put the clip facing upwards towards the phase wires, and that simply pushes into place. So you line it up and you should hear an audible click, and you should be able to pull on this and not have it come undone. And if it is coming undone and just falling out, then there's some issue and we need to look at why that is. One of the most basic, simple things to keep moisture out of this connector is to use dielectric grease. And we actually pre-use that, or we pre-apply dielectric grease to the kits that we send out. But it's always a good idea to have this stuff on hand because it's a non-conductive grease and it helps to seal things up and prevents corrosion and prevents moisture from getting in and around the plug. So you can just put a smear all around and plug it in, although we have already done that for people that are buying our kit. Another thing to think about with the main connector or the main connection going in here is not to stress this. So have this supported and don't crank it off at a weird angle, because eventually that's going to put stress on this connector and we don't want that to happen. Similarly, don't have it pulling off down to the side. So supporting this and not putting any stress on these joints will save you a lot of trouble. If you've already done a dry fit with your wiring, I definitely recommend you do that first. I find it easier to get the controller mounted in position, support the harness wires, and then route everything through to where it needs to go. Something else to consider at this point is drip edges with wiring. And there have been problems in the past where water can run back down along these wires and access the controller depending on where it's been mounted and how it's been mounted. So as well as having the controller mounted in a way that would take bulk water away, it's also important to think about water that might get on wires and run back down wires towards motors and controllers. And if you can make that so that there's a natural drip point to the ground, then again, that's just another layer of protection for your bike. So the next thing to talk about is the hall and the PAS plugs. This one's for the hall sensors and this one is for the PAS. And I prefer making these connections before making the phase wires because there's a little bit more room then to maneuver. And they're shaped and they have notches, so they only really plug in one way. So with the PAS plug, there's a little clip here and that fits in with the clip on there's a notch here and it fits in with the clip, so that one just clips in like so. And then again with the hall plug, there's another little clip here and two little notches, and they line up with notches on the inside here of the motor, and that just clips into place there, and then that's that done. So it's fairly straightforward, and then you can move this around to the right position to exit from the controller up here. If you're having trouble making these connections here, then the chances are there might be a bit of debris in there or something, so make sure you clear that out with the pick. Maybe a bit of glue still stuck on there or something, so clear it out and try it again. Another part to look for is the speed sensor plug, and this fits with the speed sensor that you already should have with your Bafang motor kit, and it's the same way as before. So you just plug it on and then you use this lock ring, which actually has a thread on it, to keep those two parts together. If for any reason this is not long enough, you can get extensions, and that very much depends on where you locate everything on your bike. If you're using a really long frame bike, then you might need to get an extension for this particular part. This plug here is the plug that takes you to the front of the bike, and this is what your Bafang harness plug that you should already have plugs into, and that's this one here, and I think it's an 8-pin, 9-pin plug, and this is what takes the connection to the front of the bike for the throttle, the brake cutoffs and the display. And we'll talk about HiGo connections and how to make those fairly soon in the video. When you do come to close everything up with the motor and you use the grommet, there is actually a slot. There is actually a slot cut out of the grommet here, and that lets you marry that up with the other wires coming out, and that lets you seal up the controller with the rubber gasket with all of the wires coming through. The key with all of this is to take it nice and slowly. Make sure you've got the wires nicely routed. Make sure nothing is pinched in place, and you shouldn't have any problems. It should go together fairly smoothly and give you a nice waterproof seal. You can use a bit of silicone in and around here if you want, but it's not really needed. The last thing to look at with this part of the install is the thermistor, and this is what allows the motor to be throttled back if it's getting too hot. And it just comes around the back of the motor, and you can usually feed it through underneath the bottom, and you want to attach it to one of the bolts around this side of the motor. So you basically loosen one of these bolts that holds it together. There's one around, it's quite hard to see at this angle, there's one around under here. So you take that bolt out, you put the thermistor through it, and then you bolt it onto the frame. And what is recommended is to use a bit of putty to seal in around it and keep it covered up, and that will minimize any wind flow that might reduce the temperature or might give you an erroneous reading. So that's really it for the wiring on the motor, and everybody's bike is going to be slightly different. So there's no point me really building this one up and saying this is how to do it 100%, because everyone will be slightly different. So from here, we're going to have a look at the front of the bike and the different peripherals that you'll be using and the displays that we offer with this kit. An important thing to talk about is the HiGo connectors, and there are various of these on the bike. Most of them are going to be of this kind, like the yellow, the green, and they connect to throttles. This is the throttle one, these two are for brake cutoffs, this is for the display, and then there is also one here which is the larger one, which I think is 8-pin, and this takes all of those connections to the back. And they can be a little daunting, a little fiddly. The pins in them are, if you can see these, they're very small and they can be quite easy to damage if you don't follow the correct procedure. But they have also arrows and they go a certain way together. So for this one, which is the main Bafang one, the trick with this is to get it lined up. So there's an arrow there and there's an arrow on this one. And you just gently make sure they go together. And you're going to feel if you've got it wrong, because you'll feel some pressure. So if you feel resistance here and it doesn't feel like it's going together well, pull them apart, make sure you've got those arrows perfectly lined up. And if you do, you just gently push it together and you should have no problems. And again, with these ones here, if we look at maybe making the throttle connection, you can see that there's an arrow on this one here. Sorry. You can see that there is an arrow on this one here. And then you can also see there will be an arrow on this one here. You see that arrow there. And there's also on the inside, there's a little notch here and a little notch on this one. And you make sure that they're all lined up. So you can feel the notches engaging at that point. Now, make sure the arrows are lined up, make sure the notch is engaged, and then you just gently pop them together. And you should have no problems. If you get this wrong though, you can bend the pins. So it's critical that you take your time with this, you make sure that they're lined up straight and then push them gently together. And if you do think you've got them misaligned and they're not lined up, pull it apart and examine the pins. Because if you do power it on at this point, you could do some damage to the controller to the point of bricking it. So take your time. If you've got any questions on HiGos, get in touch. I've never managed to make a mistake with one of these ones or get the pins bent, but I have heard of that happening. So patience is key. Take your time, make sure it's lined up right. We offer two kinds of display with this kit that we do. The first option is the 750C display, and the idea with this is that it mounts with these two bolt-on clips and it goes across the center of the bike. And there's a few things to bear in mind with this, because it's designed to fit with most bars, but not all bars are quite the same in the way they're shaped. And you can see with this one, I think it's going to go fine. It should bolt on no problems. But sometimes where it bends doesn't fit with where these plugs bolt into position, or where these plugs doesn't fit with where these clips lock into place or bolt into place. And if that is the case, then what you can find is it puts twisting stress on these, and that can crack the plastic. So if your bars don't fit quite properly with this, it's best to use some packing or some foam or something that will take the stress off this part, or you might even have to make an alternate way of mounting this in a different position. As I say, like the company that makes the displays try and fit as many bikes as possible, but it's not always possible to work. Now, there's also a switch here, and you want to locate that towards the end there, and that will let you go through the power levels, change any modes or operator, anything there. So that's fairly simple. That bolts on there. If your bars happen to be thinner, they do supply it with various bits of rubber that will let you build out the space to be a good clean fit. So that's the 750C, and that's the location where that one goes on the bike. The other display we offer with the kit is the Egg Rider display. This is a much smaller display that has the controls built in as part of it. And this one goes closer to the end of the bar here and just bolts in position, and that lets you ride the bike and operate the controls. You can put it in different places if you want. You could maybe make it so you put it in the middle or in the center. I mean, it's your bike, so you can customize it however you want, and lots of people do. You would just have to move your hand to the middle to work the power levels. You wouldn't have it as close to the hand grip. So that's the Egg Rider. Not going into any of the electronics, how to activate or doing anything with this video. This is more the parts and where they go on the bike and some tips and tricks for installing them. So that brings us to the end for this particular video, just going over the major parts of the kit and some tips and tricks for what to expect when installing them, best practices. It's not exhaustive. I recommend you take time to familiarize yourself with all the different parts, try things out, dry fit things, see what you want to do with your bike, because everyone's frame is different. If you run into anything that's really causing you problems, get in touch on the Discord, ask some questions, and we'll get you sorted out. Thanks for watching. Cheers.